At the moment in our form, we render the whole form, so not the form element actually, but all the form controls like this. And we use Django's default way of outputting the labels and the input elements and the errors. And therefore, for example, it looks like this. We got a label, then the list of error messages, and then we got the input field. Now, maybe we want to change this. What if we, for example, want to render the errors below the input field instead of between the label and the input field? How could we achieve that? For this, we can dive into our template, and instead of rendering the form as a whole here, we can render the individual parts of our form. So for example, still with the double curly braces, we can start with outputting our label. For this, we access our form, but then with the dot notation, we dive into one of our fields. In this case, the only field we have, the username field. So form.username, and then we want to output the label of that username. And we do this with the label underscore tag field here. This will render the label. Then below that, we might want the actual input element, which we render with just form.username. So just the field itself without any nested property. So this will render the input element itself. And if we want to render the errors below that, then we can do so by accessing form.user_name.errors. And now we'll switch that order for that field. And we would have to do that for all the fields of our form now. It's either the entire form being rendered or everything being customized, but I will show you ways of speeding that up and making that more convenient later once we have more than one field. At the moment, the username field is the only field we have, and therefore this is perfectly fine. If we now do that and reload here, you see we now have label, input, and then the error messages. So now we have that order specified in our template. Now that we know that we don't have to render a form as a whole, we can of course customize it even more, and we have even more influence on how things are going to be output. For example, we might want to wrap every form control, so like the input element and its label and its errors, into a div for styling purposes with a certain CSS class. So where we add a class of form-control, for example, which at the moment doesn't add any styling, but which we could use to apply some styling. And then different form controls would live in different divs. We also might want to add a CSS class dynamically here when that input is invalid. A CSS class which we could then use to, for example, give the input a red border. For that, we might want to add an invalid class to this surrounding div if the input in there is invalid. And we can do this with an if tag, for example, here. So here we can add an if tag and check if form.username.errors. This will return true if it's not an empty object in the end. So if this is a dictionary with error messages inside, if that is the case, then I add the errors class here, and then I end if. So I'm using that if tag now inside of my class list for this div, but therefore this errors class will only be added if we do have errors. And with that adjustment made, if I save that and reload, now we have this extra div wrapped around our inputs, and it does have this error class. If I visit localhost 8000 like this instead of reloading though, and I therefore have the empty valid form initially, then we see this errors class is not there on this class list. And at the moment we're not utilizing any CSS classes for styling. We're going to do that soon, but we could use it. And this shows you how you can still fine-tune how your controls and your inputs are being labeled, are being output, and how they might be styled therefore, whilst still utilizing the built-in form support by Django, for example, for this convenient validation. And now with all of that in place, let's actually add some styling and then a second input.